Hey there, welcome to my channel. I just started this channel, and your support means the world to me. It helps me keep sharing the stories I love. This video is completely ad-free and designed to help you fall asleep fast and comfortably. Like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of stories I share here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to feel connected with all of you. Now, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like, and let's drift into tonight's stories together. Story 1. I was chosen for a sleep experiment. No one told me I'd be the only subject left. The advertisement was unassuming, tucked between a plea for plasma donors and a gig for a part-time dog walker. It was printed in the bland sans-serif font of institutional efficiency. Volunteers needed for paid somnology study. Participants must be in good health, age 21-35, with no history of sleep disorders. Compensation, $15,000 for a 2-week commitment. 15 grand. To a freelance graphic designer like me, neck deep in student loans and living off ramen that tasted of salty despair, that number wasn't just compensation. It was a lifeline. It was 2 months' rent, a down payment on a reliable car, a chance to breathe. All I had to do was sleep. It sounded like the easiest money I would ever make. My name is Leo, and my capacity for optimism has always been my most dangerous flaw. The intake process took place in a sterile downtown office building that smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and quiet desperation. I sat on a plastic chair, filling out a questionnaire that probed every corner of my life, from my childhood fears to my current caffeine intake. One by one, we were called back to meet the man in charge, Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from a block of granite and then polished to a high sheen. He had a perfectly trimmed gray beard, sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a smile that was both reassuring and utterly devoid of warmth. The purpose of Project Morpheus, he explained to me, his voice a smooth, confident baritone, is to study the effect of a new neurostimulant, which we're calling somnolent. Our hypothesis is that it can dramatically enhance the restorative qualities of REM sleep, allowing the brain to achieve in 4 hours what it normally would in 8. Imagine the applications, Mr. Vance. Increased productivity, accelerated learning, even rapid trauma processing. He made it sound like we were on the cusp of curing the human condition itself. I nodded along, pretending to be fascinated by the science, but all I could see were dollar signs. There were 4 other subjects chosen alongside me. We were a motley crew, united by our shared need for a quick payday. There was Marcus, a former Marine, with a cynical smirk and a web of tattoos crawling up his neck. Chloe, a bubbly, perpetually cheerful art student with magenta-streaked hair. Ben, a quiet, socially awkward programmer who seemed to communicate better with his laptop than with people. And Zara, a high-strung grad student who jumped at every unexpected noise. The facility was located in the basement of the same office building, but it felt like a different world. A series of heavy soundproof doors led us into a self-contained habitat, a windowless bunker of stark white walls, soft gray carpet, and recessed lighting that mimicked a 24-hour cycle. The air was cool and tasted filtered, recycled. We were completely cut off from the outside world. No phones, no internet. Our home for the next 14 days. Each of us was assigned a small, comfortable room. It contained a single bed embedded with a latticework of sensors, a small desk, and a camera mounted in the upper corner of the ceiling, a dispassionate, unblinking eye. Dr. Finch assured us it was only for monitoring our sleep patterns and ensuring our safety. A pleasant communal area with a kitchenette and a small library of pre-approved books and board games served as our living room. It was all designed to be calming, a sterile, controlled womb. But as that final door hissed shut behind us, locking us in, I felt a tremor of unease. It didn't feel like a womb. It felt like a tomb. The first few days were almost comically benign. We'd sleep in our sensor-laden beds and IV line taped to our arms, delivering what Finch called a microdose of somnolin. During our waking hours, which were strictly regulated, we underwent a battery of tests, memory games, logic puzzles, reaction time assessments. We'd fill out detailed questionnaires about our dreams, our moods, our energy levels. And at first, it was incredible. I'd never felt so rested. I would wake up feeling a profound sense of clarity, as if my mind had been decluttered and polished overnight. My dreams were vivid, cinematic. I dreamt of soaring over mountain ranges, of revisiting a perfect, sun-drenched day from my childhood. The others reported similar experiences. Chloe was dreaming up entire galleries of fantastical paintings. Ben claimed to have solved a complex coding problem in his sleep. We felt like pioneers of the mind. The $15,000 felt like a steal. The change began on the fourth night. The pleasant technicolor dreams began to bleed at the edges. I had a dream that I was wandering the sterile white corridors of the facility, but the layout was all wrong. Hallways stretched into impossible lengths, and doors opened into brick walls. I felt a gnawing sense of anxiety, a feeling of being watched. I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding, a cold sweat slicking my skin. At breakfast, I noticed the shift in the others, too. Marcus was sullen and aggressive, snapping at Ben for chewing too loudly. Chloe, usually a font of incessant cheer, was quiet, her eyes distant. She had a sketchbook open on the table, and on the page was a disturbing abstract drawing of a tall, stick-thin figure made of swirling, chaotic lines. "I keep seeing him," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "At the edge of my dreams. He just watches." That night, my dream picked up where the last one left off. I was back in the twisting, labyrinthine corridors. But this time, I wasn't alone. I saw him, the figure from Chloe's drawing. He was at the far end of a long hallway, a gaunt, impossibly tall man in what looked like an old-fashioned tattered doctor's coat. His face was a blur of shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and malevolent. I woke up not with a gasp, but with a choked, silent scream. The waking world was becoming just as strange. I started to experience micro-hallucinations, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, the sound of my name whispered from an empty room. The puzzles Dr. Finch gave us were becoming more difficult, almost nonsensical, designed to frustrate and disorient. The first to break was Zara. During a particularly grueling cognitive test, she suddenly threw her tablet against the wall. "It's a trick!" she shrieked, her eyes wide with terror. "The questions are changing when I'm not looking. He's changing them." Dr. Finch and his assistant, a young, nervous-looking woman named Anya, rushed in. Zara was hysterical, clawing at her own arms. They injected her with a sedative. She has a pre-existing anxiety condition she failed to disclose, Finch announced to the rest of us, his voice a mask of clinical concern. For her own safety, she is being withdrawn from the study. They carried her out. The heavy door hissed shut, and then there were four. The atmosphere in the communal room turned toxic. Ben became convinced the cameras were recording our thoughts. He started speaking in whispers, covering his mouth with his hand. Marcus paced the floor like a caged animal, his eyes darting back and forth, his cynicism curdling into raw paranoia. We were lab rats, and we were beginning to realize that the maze we were in was far more complex than we had imagined. The next night, the dose of somnolin was increased. That night, I didn't just dream of the gaunt man. I met him. I was in a nightmarish version of my childhood home. He was there, standing in the living room, his shadowy face turned towards me. He didn't speak, but a voice echoed in my head, a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "You don't belong here," it said. "This place is mine." I woke up swinging, my fist connecting with the wall beside my bed. The pain was a grounding, welcome sensation. Ben was next to go. He'd barricaded himself in his room, refusing to come out. We could hear him through the door, muttering about firewalls and corrupted code, convinced that the Watcher was trying to hack into his brain. It took Finch and two large orderlies he seemed to produce from nowhere to force the door open and drag him out, sedated and silent. "An unfortunate psychotic break," Finch explained, his expression unreadable. "The somnolent can have an amplifying effect on latent mental instabilities." Now there were three. Fear was a constant metallic taste in my mouth. We were trapped with a man who was either a madman or a monster, and the line between the two was becoming increasingly blurry. Marcus, Chloe, and I huddled together in the communal room, a tribe of the terrified. Marcus was convinced the food was being drugged. Chloe wouldn't stop drawing the gaunt man, her sketchbook now a gallery of horrors. Pages and pages of the same stick-thin figure, his face always a void of shadow. "I saw a name," she whispered to me, her eyes wide and haunted. "In my dream last night. I was in Finch's office. There was a plaque on the wall, an old one. It said, 'In Memoriam, Dr. Elias Thorne, a pioneer who gave his life in the pursuit of knowledge.'" Marcus tried to make a break for it. He waited for one of the orderlies to bring in a food tray and tried to rush the door. He was strong, but they were ready for him. A taser crackled, and he went down, convulsing on the soft gray carpet. They dragged his unconscious body away. No explanation was given this time. We didn't need one. We knew the rules of this twisted game now. There was no escape. And then there were two. Chloe and I were the only ones left. We were ghosts haunting the sterile white halls of our prison. We tried to stay awake, taking turns watching over each other, but the exhaustion was a physical weight crushing us. And the IV drips were mandatory. Anya, the assistant, would come in, her face pale and strained, and check the lines. I could see the pity in her eyes, but also the fear. She was as much a prisoner as we were. "He's getting stronger," Chloe mumbled, her head lolling against my shoulder. We were huddled on the sofa, a single blanket wrapped around us. "Thorne, I think he died here, in this facility. I think the experiment. It's not what Finch told us." That was the last coherent thing she said to me. The next time I saw her, she was asleep in her bed. But it wasn't a normal sleep. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. She was breathing, but she was gone, a shell. Anya came in to check on her, and let out a small, strangled cry. Finch was right behind her. He showed no emotion as he shone a penlight into Chloe's unblinking eyes. "A catatonic state," he said, his voice as calm as if he were describing the weather. "A potential, though rare, side effect. It was all outlined in the consent form you signed." He turned his cold, analytical gaze on me. "Which means, Mr. Vance, that you are the last one, the most resilient, the perfect subject. The experiment can now proceed to its final stage." I was alone, the sole survivor of Project Morpheus. The full, crushing weight of that realization sent a shock-wave of pure terror through me. I lunged for the IV in my arm, intending to rip it out, but an alarm blared through the facility, a piercing, deafening shriek. Finch's voice boomed from a hidden speaker. "I wouldn't do that, Leo, don't you see? We are on the verge of a monumental breakthrough. This was never about enhancing sleep. It was about mapping the landscape within sleep. Somnolin doesn't create dreams. It dissolves the barrier. It opens a door." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a neurostimulant study. It was a cartography expedition into a haunted house. And we were the explorers sent in to map the darkness. The others weren't gone. They were lost. Their minds had been consumed by the landscape, by the dominant entity within it, the consciousness of Dr. Elias Thorne, a ghost in the machine. "He was the first," Finch's voice continued, a manic excitement creeping into his tone. "The original researcher. He tested his own formulas, pushed the boundaries too far. His consciousness became imprinted on the very fabric of this place, creating a stable, psychic echo, a new frontier. And you, Leo, you are my Vasco da Gama. You are going to step onto the shore." I knew with a sickening certainty that if I fell asleep again, I would not wake up. Thorne was waiting for me. Finch was waiting to observe. I was a tethered goat, and the tiger was circling. I spent the next cycle, I couldn't tell if it was day or night, pacing my room, splashing my face with cold water, pinching myself, anything to stay awake. But my body was betraying me. My eyelids were lead weights. The white walls of my room seemed to soften and waver at the edges. The barrier was already dissolving. I saw him, not in a dream, but in reality. He was standing in the doorway of my room, a shimmering heat-haze distortion in the air. The gaunt, skeletal figure of Elias Thorne. The dream was bleeding into the world, and in that moment of absolute terror, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. I couldn't fight Finch in the real world. I couldn't fight Thorne in this one. But if the barrier was gone, then the connection worked both ways. I couldn't run, but maybe I could fight back. I lay down on the bed. I let my eyes close. I let the crushing exhaustion pull me under. But this time, I didn't fall. I dove. I went into the dreamscape with a purpose. I found myself not in the corridors, but in what looked like an old, archaic laboratory. Beakers bubbled with black liquid, wires snaked across the floor like dead vines. And in the center of it all was Thorne. He was more solid here, more real. His face was a pale, skeletal mask of pain and rage. "You cannot win," the voice echoed in my head, a psychic roar. "I am this world." "Then your world is about to end," I thought back, focusing all my will, all my identity, into a single point of resistance. Finch wanted a show. I would give him one. I stopped fighting Thorne's influence and instead focused on the environment. I remembered the happiest day of my life, a trip to the beach with my family when I was a kid. I flooded the dark, musty lab with the memory, the brilliant, blinding sunlight, the sound of crashing waves, the smell of salt and sunscreen. The dreamscape recoiled. Thorne shrieked, clutching his shadowy head as the light burned him. The dark lab flickered, the beakers and wires replaced by sand and seashells. This is my mind, I projected, pouring all my anger, my fear, my desperate will to live into the thought. My dream, and you are not welcome here. I focused on the machines, the sophisticated monitoring equipment I knew was attached to me in the real world. In the dream, I imagined them overloading. I visualized the main console in Finch's control room, the one I had only glimpsed on a schematic. I pictured the screens cracking, the wires sparking, the whole thing erupting in a shower of electrical fire. I poured every ounce of my focus into that single, destructive image. A sound jolted me, a real sound, an alarm, the smell of smoke. My eyes snapped open. I was back in my room. The facility's emergency lights were flashing, casting the white walls in a hellish red glow. The speaker on the wall was crackling with static. I had done it. I had created a feedback loop, my mental projection of destruction causing a real-world overload. My door hissed open. Anya stood there, her face white with terror and resolve. "Go!" she screamed. "The main breaker blew. The system locks are failing. Go now!" I didn't hesitate. I scrambled out of the room, my legs weak and trembling. The corridor was filled with acrid smoke. As I ran, I glanced through the reinforced window into the control room. It was chaos. Sparks rained down from a burned-out console, and in the middle of it all stood Dr. Finch. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't trying to put out the fire. He was staring at his monitors, at the chaotic spiking lines of my EEG, and he was smiling, an ecstatic, triumphant smile. I didn't look back again. I ran through the labyrinth of corridors, following Anya's frantic gestures, until we reached the final door. She swiped a card, and it opened onto a grimy service staircase. The air that hit me was stale and damp, but it was real air. It was the air of the world. I burst out of a nondescript metal door into a back alley. The gray early morning light was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I was free. That was 6 months ago. I have the money. It was wired to my account the day I was admitted, as promised. But I lost everything else. I live in a different city under a different name. And I don't sleep. Not really. I drift in and out of a state of hallucinatory exhaustion, never letting myself go completely under. I'm terrified of what's waiting for me on the other side of that door. The experiment was a success. I know it was. Because sometimes when the light is dim and I'm looking at my reflection in a darkened window, the face that looks back isn't my own. For just a fraction of a second, I see a tall, gaunt man with a pale, skeletal face and eyes that burn with a cold, ancient hunger. Finch opened a door, and I was the one who walked through. But I'm beginning to understand the terrifying truth. I didn't come back alone. I found a hidden room behind my mirror. Someone was living there. I inherited the apartment from my great-aunt Beatrice, a woman whose life had been a meticulous study in quiet routine right up until the point where she wasn't quiet anymore. It was a pre-war brownstone unit, 3 floors up, with impossibly high ceilings, crown molding that looked like carved icing, and a labyrinthine heating system that hissed and groaned like a sleeping dragon. The whole place smelled faintly of mothballs and old dry paper, and while it was beautiful, it was undeniably old, full of architectural secrets and the kind of strange permanent shadows that modern lighting couldn't seem to dispel. I moved in because the rent was non-existent, and because I, too, enjoyed the quiet routine that the building seemed to enforce. The apartment's master bathroom was particularly strange. It was large and overly ornate for a bathroom, featuring a clawfoot tub and a massive, antique-looking mirror that dominated the entire wall above the pedestal sink. The mirror was huge, framed in dark, heavy carved oak, and it was bolted directly into the plaster. It wasn't the kind of mirror you could simply lift and move. It felt like a fixture, a permanent portal in the room's history. I tried to clean it, but the glass had an inherent subtle distortion, a kind of rippling imperfection that made my reflection seem slightly warped, stretched, or sometimes just out of sync with my movements. I put it down to the age of the glass and the silver backing, but I always felt an unpleasant chill when I stood too close to it, a strange, localized cold spot that lingered no matter how high I cranked the radiator. It was that cold spot that first became a nuisance and then a horrifying clue. I am a meticulous person, a creature of habit and order, and I hate inefficiency. The draft, or whatever it was wasting my heat. I started my investigation with a thermal gun, the kind used for home energy audits. The plaster wall around the mirror registered a consistent 72 degrees, the room temperature. But the exact center of the mirror, the focal point where my reflection's face usually was, registered a baffling 58 degrees. It was a localized, persistent cold, not a draft, but a chill coming from inside the wall. Intrigued, I tapped the glass. The sound was solid near the edges, a heavy, dull thud of glass against plaster. But as I moved my knuckles toward the cold spot, the thud changed. It became hollower, lighter, an echoing, unsettling tap, tap, tap that suggested a significant, unsupported cavity behind the frame. I ran my hand over the oak frame, feeling for a hinge or a latch, but the thing was bolted down with iron screws that had been painted over and sealed with layers of glossy enamel. I decided I had to see what was back there. It was likely a bricked-up chimney flue, a long-forgotten service shaft, or maybe just a clumsy repair job. I told myself it was for the sake of energy efficiency. It took me 3 hours with a screwdriver, a utility knife, and a lot of swearing to chip away the paint and pry the decorative molding off the mirror's frame. The frame itself was held in place by 4 enormous heavy-gauge bolts sunk deep into the wall. As I loosened the last one, the massive mirror gave a shudder and pitched forward an inch, revealing a shocking amount of dust and grime and a thin, dark line of shadow between the frame and the wall. I slowly, carefully, lowered the mirror onto the bathroom floor, the glass reflecting the ceiling and the frantic, pale image of my own face. What was revealed was not a bricked-up flue, but an archway. It was a small, crudely cut opening in the plaster and lath, roughly the size of a man's torso, almost perfectly centered where the cold spot had been. The edges of the opening were ragged, showing the inner structure of the wall, but there was no plaster dust on the floor below it. That meant the opening had been there for a long time. The biggest shock, however, was what the opening led to. It didn't lead to darkness or a void or the back of a chimney. It led to a space that was clearly a room. I shone the flashlight of my phone into the cavity. It wasn't a standard crawl space. It was a narrow, elongated room, maybe 6 feet wide and 15 feet long, running parallel to the bathroom wall and extending into the dead space between my apartment and the building's main staircase, or maybe another unit. The walls were unfinished brick, and the floor was covered in a layer of old, fine, metallic-smelling dust, the kind that accumulates in forgotten, unventilated spaces. But the dust had been disturbed. There was a clear, swept pathway leading from the opening deeper into the dark. And then I saw the objects. The first thing I registered was a sleeping cot, a simple canvas military-style bed positioned in the furthest corner. It was neatly made, but the pillow was dented, the blanket slightly rumpled, a clear sign of recent use. Next to the cot, there was a makeshift shelf fashioned from a piece of old wood placed atop 2 stacked bricks, and on that shelf a few personal items: a small tarnished silver cup, a worn, paper-covered book that I couldn't make out the title of, and next to the shelf, tucked discreetly against the wall, a 5-gallon plastic bucket, presumably for sanitary purposes. But the detail that locked the horror in my throat, freezing the air in my lungs, was the tray. Placed near the opening, directly facing where the mirror had been, was a small silver-rimmed tea tray. On it sat a ceramic plate with half a tuna salad sandwich, neatly cut and covered with a piece of plastic wrap. It wasn't moldy. The bread hadn't gone stale. It had been left there at most a few hours prior. Someone was living here. Someone had been living here today. I took a step back, the phone slipping in my sweaty hand. The person who lived here was not a vagrant who had broken in. This room was an architectural anomaly, a permanent hidden space accessed through a secret hole in my wall, a hole that was covered by a massive, centuries-old mirror. The occupant had to have known the architecture, had to have a key, or an incredible talent for stealth. Then my eyes snapped back to the opening, and specifically to the inner side of the mirror frame that was now resting on my floor. I ran my fingers over the glass. On the side that had faced the wall where the archway was, there was a patch of clear, pristine glass about the size of a small window pane. The rest of the backing was opaque and silvery, but this one section had been chemically stripped, replaced by a specialized translucent film. It wasn't a mirror on that side at all. It was a cleverly disguised one-way window. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a rush of nausea that made the already close air of the bathroom feel suffocating. I hadn't just been looking at my reflection for the past 2 months. I had been observed. Every morning, shaving, brushing my teeth, staring into the glass, I hadn't been alone. The person inside had been watching me, their cot positioned perfectly so that my face, my routine, the minutiae of my solitary life were their entertainment, their window to the outside world. The slight distortion I had always complained about was the result of the crude one-way film, not the age of the glass. The cold spot was their breathing, their body temperature, their proximity to the pain. I scrambled out of the bathroom, shutting the door and locking it with a desperate, frantic click of the cheap brass bolt. I called the police. When they arrived, they were skeptical. They were thorough, though, and they crawled into the space. They found the cot, the bucket, the shelf. But the sandwich was gone. The plate was empty. wiped clean. The book was closed and pushed further back on the shelf. The police found no fingerprintable surfaces, no documents, no evidence of a crime beyond trespassing. They theorized it was a transient, a squatter who knew the old building's layout, who had been hiding there, and who had fled when I started removing the mirror. They taped off the area, filed a report that mentioned a likely unhoused individual, and left. I knew they didn't believe the part about the one-way mirror, suggesting I was overreacting due to the shock. I didn't replace the mirror. I couldn't. Instead, I boarded up the archway with 2x4s and several layers of drywall, sealing the opening with a thick coat of plaster, the smell of which was meant to replace the metallic dust I had smelled. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the person had fled the building, but the knowledge of the hidden room had irrevocably altered my reality. That's when the sounds began. They weren't coming from the sealed-up mirror room, or at least not only from there. They came from the walls, not the loud, familiar creaks of an old building settling, but soft, dry, insidious noises. A faint, rhythmic scrabbling like fingernails on dusty plaster, or the movement of a tiny animal, but too controlled, too deliberate to be a mouse. A soft, measured thump-tap slide, a sound that seemed to be traveling in the dead spaces between the joists, the service shafts, and the vertical pipes of the ancient heating system. I would be reading in my living room, and the sound would be directly behind the bookcase. I would be in my kitchen, and it would seem to emanate from the space between the cupboard and a wall. I realized the mirror room wasn't the person's only space. It was their observatory. Their home was the entire forgotten, hidden infrastructure of the building, a complex, dark network of architectural dead space that was only accessible to someone impossibly small, flexible, and utterly silent. They were living in the negative space of the brownstone like a parasite in the host's body, and my apartment was merely one visible surface of their sprawling, invisible habitat. The terror became an exquisite, personalized form of psychological torture. My things would be subtly moved. I would leave my wallet on the hall table and later find it pushed half an inch further toward the wall. I'd be certain I'd close the window latch before leaving for work, only to find it slightly ajar when I returned. One evening I reached for my toothbrush and noticed it was distinctly wet when I knew I hadn't used it for hours. These were not the signs of a burglar or a vandal. They were the signs of an intimate observer, someone who had learned my habits so well they could use the briefest moments of my absence to slip out, move freely, and then retreat back into the silent, dusty labyrinth. The ultimate psychological attack came one night when I was asleep. I woke up suddenly with that visceral jolt of someone watching you. The room was black, silent, the kind of absolute darkness that presses down on your eyelids. I held my breath, listening, the frantic hammering of my own heart deafening in my ears. And then I heard it, a soft, dry, almost papery cough that came from the wall directly behind my headboard. It was the cough of a person, but one whose lungs were choked with old dust and the dry air of unventilated space. It was right there. I shot out of bed, slammed on the light, and stared at the beige, innocuous wall. Nothing. No vent, no crack, no seam. Just the solid, painted plaster. I stopped trying to escape the reality. I accepted terrible truth. I was sharing my life with an elegant, silent shadow, a forgotten dweller of the city's unseen spaces who used my apartment as a source of warmth and human observation. I went to the sealed-up bathroom. The freshly plastered archway looked solid, but I could hear a faint, high-pitched, scritching sound coming from within the wall. I grabbed a Sharpie and a piece of paper, and I taped the note to the newly painted wall directly over where the one-way mirror had been. The words were a mix of desperation and challenge. "Who are you? Please, stop. Why are you here? You need help." The next morning, the note was gone. The tape was still there, a pale frame around nothing. In its place, stuck to the plaster with a tiny, nearly invisible dab of what looked like dried mud, was a small, meticulously folded piece of paper, no bigger than a matchbook. I had to use tweezers to retrieve it. The handwriting was thin, elegant, almost spider-like, a script from a forgotten century, yet completely legible. The message was 3 chilling, impossible words. "I am your silent twin. You are too loud." The insult wasn't just in the words. It was in the revelation that my life, my quiet life, was an intolerable racket to this person. My movements, my breathing, the sound of my television, the scraping of my chair, all of it was a cacophony disrupting their perfect, absolute silence. I knew I had to see them. I had to know what kind of human being could exist in such a space. I had to face my silent twin. That night, I waited. I set up my phone on a tripod with the flash off, recording video, and I sat on the floor of the bathroom, a blanket wrapped around me, a heavy wrench lying uselessly beside me. The main lights were off, the only illumination coming from the thin sliver of light beneath the door. Hours passed. The building settled. The heating system finally fell silent. I was a man of routine, and my routine was to sleep. Despite the fear, despite the adrenaline, my body betrayed me. I slumped against the wall, and exhaustion, my old enemy, finally claimed me. I woke with a jolt. The air in the room was suddenly, drastically colder. I hadn't heard a sound. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking, and looked at the time. 3:17 a.m. I had been asleep for maybe 20 minutes. I stared at the sealed archway, expecting to see a fresh hole, but the plaster was intact. The scrabbling sound, however, was back, and it was loud, no longer behind the plaster, but right next to me. I realized the sound was coming from the air vent near the floor, the old cast-iron grill on the baseboard that fed the heating system. I spun around, wrench in hand, and focused the dim light of the phone screen on the vent. It wasn't just a sound. The vent cover was slightly ajar, tilted outward at a small, impossible angle, and from the thin black gap created by that angle, something was moving. It was a person, impossibly thin, dressed in layers of old dusty gray fabric that seemed to blend perfectly with the shadows and the dirty plaster. Their face was a pale, wedge-shaped mask, their hair matted with dust. But their eyes were the thing that held me. They were huge, dinner-plate-sized, dilated to absolute blackness, reflecting the pinprick of my phone light like twin black mirrors. They were the eyes of a creature accustomed to near absolute, perpetual darkness, eyes that found my faint illumination blinding. They were not menacing. They were terrified. They froze, seeing me, the light, the weapon. For a single, terrifying second, our lives intersected, the man of the light, the man of the dark. And then, with an impossible fluidity, a speed that defied the limits of the human skeleton, the creature slid backward, not running, but smoothly retreating, pulling their thin, dusty body through the narrow ventilation grill. I heard the sound of dry, brittle bones flexing and the rustle of old cloth. The cast-iron grill, which was heavy and usually required a screwdriver to move, pulled itself shut with a soft, decisive click. I sat there for an hour, the light blazing, the wrench still in my hand, staring at the perfectly closed vent. I knew I couldn't report this. I knew the police would institutionalize me. I knew I was not safe. I moved out the next day. I left the furniture, the keys, everything. I moved to a sleek, modern glass and steel apartment tower, a sterile world of new construction where there are no hidden spaces, no old service shafts, no architectural dead zones for a shadow dweller to hide. I live on the 22nd floor, surrounded by sealed walls and new HVAC systems. But I am not free. Every rhythmic thrum of the building's central air conditioning sends a cold wave of panic through me. Every shadow cast by the city lights at night seems to hold a shape that is impossibly thin. I jump at the sound of the elevator moving in the wall, and 1 month ago, a letter was forwarded to my new address from the old brownstone. It was a standard-sized envelope, the paper smelling faintly of ozone and old metallic dust. Inside, there was a single, meticulously folded piece of paper, the same spider-like script. I miss the quiet routine of your sleep. The new walls are too thin. You are still too loud. My terror is now complete. He is not in the walls of the brownstone anymore. He is not a squatter. He is a predator, or perhaps a shadow twin, and he has been following me. He has learned my quiet routine, and I know that somewhere in the dead space between the insulation, the vents, and the concrete of my new modern high-rise, there is a pair of black, dilated eyes watching me, waiting for me to be still enough, quiet enough, for him to slip out and finally introduce himself. And I know with crushing certainty that I will never be truly alone again. The house was a gift from a ghost. Not a literal one, of course, but the ghost of a life I was supposed to have lived. It had been bought by my husband, Michael, a man who had loved the solid, tangible things of the world, the heft of an old book, the grain of reclaimed timber, the satisfying click of a well-made lock. He had bought it 3 weeks before a slick of black ice on a mountain road had turned our shared future into a singular, desolate present. He had seen the house, an old, forgotten Victorian dowager on a cliff overlooking the sea, and had declared it the place where we would grow old, a beautiful, sprawling repository for our future memories. I, a forensic sketch artist, a man who made his living by giving faces to the faceless, was left to inherit a future I no longer had a partner for. My name is Elias Vance. For the first 6 months after the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to even visit the house. It sat empty, a monument to a future that had been canceled. But the lease on my city apartment was ending, and the thought of finding a new sterile space, a place untouched by Michael's memory, was somehow more painful than confronting the one he had chosen for us. So I packed my life into a series of sad brown cardboard boxes and moved to the ghost house. It was beautiful in a sad, neglected way. The salt-laced wind had scoured the paint from the cedar shingles, leaving the wood a soft, silvery gray. The rooms were large and airy, with high ceilings and tall, multi-paned windows that were perpetually fogged with a thin, greasy layer of sea mist. The house was a project, and I, A man with nothing but time and a grief so profound it felt like a full-time job needed a project. The face appeared in the plaster. It was in the master bedroom, a vast, cold room on the second floor with a panoramic view of the churning gray Atlantic. A leak in the roof, probably decades old, had left a sprawling, complex water stain on the wall opposite the bed. It was a chaotic, organic map of brown and yellow continents on a sea of peeling ecru-colored paint. And in the heart of that map, I began to see it. At first, it was just pareidolia, the mind's desperate innate need to find patterns in chaos. As a forensic artist, I was more susceptible to it than most. My brain was professionally trained to see the ghost of a face in the vaguest of shapes, to find a hint of a jawline in a shadow, the suggestion of an eye socket in a blur. I would lie in bed in the profound oceanic silence of the house, and I would watch the shifting light of the moon play across the stain, and I would see the face. It was a man's face, gaunt and long, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. It was a face from a forgotten photograph, a tin-type ghost. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a symptom of a mind that was raw and tired and lonely. I decided to paint the room, to exorcise the stain and its phantom inhabitant with a clean, sterile coat of decorator's white. I spent a full day prepping the walls, scraping away the peel and paint, patching the cracks. The old plaster was a strange, fibrous, and almost organic thing, mixed with what looked like horsehair, a common building material from the era. As I worked, I felt a strange, almost imperceptible coolness emanating from the stained section of the wall, a pocket of cellar-cold air in the otherwise mild room. The next day, I applied the first coat of paint. The thick white primer covered the stain completely, leaving a blank, uniform, and blessedly featureless surface. I felt a sense of profound, almost cleansing relief. I had erased the ghost. I had imposed order on the chaos. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months, but when I woke up in the gray pre-dawn light, I saw that the stain had returned. It had bled through the fresh, thick coat of primer, a faint, brownish watermark that was impossibly more detailed, more defined than before. And the face was no longer a vague suggestion. It was a portrait. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. The features were clear now, the long, straight nose, the thin, unsmiling lips, the hollows of the cheeks, and the eyes. The eyes were the most terrifying part. They were just two dark, almond-shaped smudges, but they were looking directly at me. They were not the blank, empty eyes of a painting. They were the focused, intelligent, and deeply, profoundly, anciently sad eyes of a conscious observer. My rational mind, a sputtering, dying engine, tried to offer up a scientific explanation, a chemical reaction. The specific mineral content of the water in the plaster reacting with the latex in the paint. It was a plausible, if unlikely, theory. But it did not explain the eyes. It did not explain the chilling and deeply personal feeling of being watched. I refused to be driven from my own bedroom. I was a man of science, of logic. I was a man who drew lines, who defined the world in shades of graphite and charcoal. This was just a problem of chemistry and perception. But the face continued to evolve. Each morning it was a little clearer, a little more detailed. The faint suggestion of an earlobe appeared, the subtle, incised line of a wrinkle at the corner of an eye. It was as if a photograph was slowly agonizingly developing in the very substance of my wall. My professional curiosity, a thing I had thought long dead, began to stir, a morbid and perhaps self-destructive counterpoint to my growing terror. I began to sketch it. I would sit on a stool at the foot of my bed, my large leather-bound sketchbook in my lap, and I would draw the face in the wall. It was a strange and deeply unsettling reversal of my usual work. I was not drawing a face from the fragmented emotional memories of a traumatized victim. I was drawing a face that was itself a memory, trapped in the plaster of my home. The act of drawing it was an act of intimacy. I came to know its every contour, its every subtle melancholic detail. It was a handsome face in a severe old-world way, a face that had known suffering. As I drew, the cool spot on the wall seemed to grow, to push out into the room, a palpable, invisible column of frigid air. My nights became a ritual of surveillance. I would lie in bed, my eyes fixed on the face, which was now so clear it was like looking at a faded, sepia-toned photograph. And I began to notice a new and infinitely more terrifying phenomenon. It was changing, not its features, but its expression. One night, the thin, straight line of its lips seemed to curve just slightly at the corners into a faint and deeply unsettling smile. Another night, the dark, smudged eyes seemed to widen just for a fraction of a second, as if in surprise. I was not just observing a static image. I was interacting with a responsive and sentient entity. I had to know who he was. My investigation became an obsession, a frantic, desperate dive into the history of the house, of the land it was built on. I spent my days in the dusty, silent archives of the local historical society, a man haunted not just by a ghost, but by a need for a name. The house had been built in 1888 by a man named Dr. Alastair Finch. The name sent a jolt of recognition through me. Finch. There was a wing at the city's main teaching hospital named after him. He was a pioneering anatomist, a brilliant and notoriously reclusive figure from the city's early history. He had built the house as a private retreat, a place to conduct his research far from the prying eyes of the academic world. The records were sparse. He had lived in a house alone, save for a single, taciturn housekeeper. He had no wife, no children. He was known for his obsessive, and some said morbid, dedication to his work. And then, in the winter of 1903, he had simply vanished. The housekeeper had arrived one morning to find the house empty. The doors were locked from the inside. Nothing was out of place. Dr. Finch's coat was on its hook, his half-finished breakfast on the table. He was just gone. The police had searched for months. They had dragged the sea. They had scoured the woods. They had found nothing. Alastair Finch had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. I found a single, grainy photograph of him in an old medical journal. I held the journal in my trembling hands, my breath catching in my throat. It was him. The same long, gaunt face, the same high cheekbones, the same deep-set, sad, and intelligent eyes. The face in my wall was the face of Dr. Alastair Finch, a man who had disappeared from this very house over a century ago. The rational scientific explanations were now a distant, laughable memory. I was living in a haunted house, but it was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It was not the spirit of a dead man. It was the spirit of a man who had never been found, a man who was perhaps not dead at all, a man who was somewhere else, somewhere inside my walls. My great-uncle Henry's journals from the previous story about the mirror came to mind. Not ghosts, but echoes. My research into Dr. Finch led me down a darker, more esoteric path. He had not just been an anatomist. His later work, which had been dismissed by the medical community as the ravings of an eccentric, had been focused on what he called cellular memory. He believed that the human body was not just a machine of flesh and blood, but a vessel for a kind of energetic residue. He believed that a powerful, focused consciousness could, at the moment of extreme duress or concentration, leave an imprint of itself on its surrounding environment, an echo, a psychic photograph, and I found his formula. In a letter to a colleague, a letter in which he was clearly trying to secure funding for his increasingly strange research, he had described a new experimental plaster he had developed, a plaster that was not mixed with horsehair and sand, but with a fine, powdered, and deeply unsettling mixture of human bone ash and silver nitrate. He claimed it was the perfect medium, a kind of psychic film, capable of capturing the final, desperate, energetic imprint of a human soul. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to sit down. My walls were not just walls. They were a tomb, a recording medium. And the face of Dr. Finch was not a stain. It was a photograph, taken from the inside. He had not vanished. He had imprinted himself. He had become a part of the house. The phenomena began to escalate, to bleed out from the wall and into the room itself. I would hear a soft, dry, whispering sound at night, like the sound of a page being turned in an old, brittle book. I would wake up to find the objects on my bedside table rearranged, my sketchbook moved to the other side of the room. One morning, I found a single, perfect, and deeply disturbing handprint in the thick layer of dust on the floorboards in front of the wall. It was a long, slender hand, the hand of an academic, a surgeon, and it was as if someone had pressed their hand to the floor from the inside of the wall and the dust had settled around it. He was no longer just watching me, he was trying to reach me, and then the face began to change in a new and far more terrifying way. It began to look like me. It was a slow, subtle, and horrifying transformation. The line of the jaw would soften just slightly to match my own. The shape of the eyes would change, becoming a little wider, a little less deep-set. The thin, straight lips would become a little fuller. It was as if he was studying me, my own face, my own features, and he was incorporating them. He was using my own reflection, my own presence as a model, a template. He was overriding his own faded image with my fresh, living one. I was no longer just an observer of this phenomenon. I was a participant. I was the source material. He was not just a ghost in my house. He was a parasite, and he was feeding on my own identity. I had to get out. The thought was a primal, screaming imperative. I packed a bag, my hands shaking, my eyes darting nervously towards the wall, where the face, now a grotesque, androgynous fusion of my own features and his, watched me with a calm and deeply unsettling curiosity. I went to the front door, my hand on the knob, and the door would not open. The old, heavy, and well-made lock was frozen solid. I tried the back door. The same. The windows, the old sash-cord windows that had been painted shut for decades, were now as solid and immovable as the stone foundation of the house itself. I was trapped. The house, his body, would not let me leave. I was a prisoner in a house that was actively and intelligently trying to consume me. My last desperate hope was my sister, Sarah. She was a journalist, a hard-headed, cynical, and deeply practical woman who had always viewed my artistic temperament with a kind of affectionate pity. She was the only person I had told about the house, and she had, of course, assumed my strange behavior was just an eccentric and slightly morbid manifestation of my grief. She had promised to drive up from the city at the end of the week to check on me. I had my phone. I had a signal. I called her. My voice was a frantic, terrified mess. I told her I was trapped. I told her the house wouldn't let me out. She was silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. I could hear the deep, weary sigh of a woman who was convinced her brother had finally and completely lost his mind. "Okay, Elias," she said, her voice the calm, placating tone one uses with a frightened child or a lunatic. "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll leave right now. It will take me about 3 hours. Just try to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" 3 hours. It felt like a lifetime. I spent those 3 hours in a state of high alert, paranoid terror. I barricaded myself in the living room, as far away from the bedroom, from the wall, as I could get. The whispering was louder now, a constant, sibilant, and almost conversational murmur that was coming from all the walls at once. And in the whispering, I could hear my own name, Elias. And then the wall in the living room, the one that faced the sea, the one where Michael and I had planned to hang his favorite oversized abstract painting, began to change. The plaster began to ripple, to soften, as if it were turning from a solid to a liquid. And a new face began to emerge, a face I knew as well as my own, the face of my dead husband, Michael. It was a perfect, heartbreakingly perfect rendition of him. But his eyes were wrong. They were the same, dark, sad, and intelligent eyes as the face in the bedroom wall. It was him. It was Finch, and he was wearing Michael's face like a mask. "Don't you miss him, Elias?" the wall seemed to whisper, the voice a grotesque and deeply insulting imitation of Michael's own deep and gentle baritone. "It's so lonely here. We could be together, all three of us." The monster was not just trying to steal my face, it was trying to steal my grief. It was using my own most profound and deeply personal pain as a weapon against me. It was the ultimate violation. I screamed, a raw, ragged, and utterly hopeless sound of pure animal rage and despair. I picked up a heavy iron fire poker and I swung it at the wall, at the perfect, beautiful, and monstrous face of my dead husband. The poker hit the wall with a dull, wet, and sickening thud, as if I had struck a side of beef. The plaster did not crack. It bruised. A dark, ugly, purplish mark appeared, and the face of Michael contorted, not in pain, but in a slow and deeply, deeply satisfied smile. It was feeding on it. My rage, my despair, my violent and desperate and futile and grief-stricken and love-filled action, they were its food. My emotional energy was the very thing that was allowing it to break through, to become more real, more solid. I dropped the poker, my body going limp with the sudden, horrifying realization I could not fight it. Fighting it only made it stronger. I was in a cage with a monster, and the monster was feeding on my own desperate attempts to escape. I heard the sound of a car on the gravel driveway. Sarah, she was here. I ran to the window. Her small, sensible sedan was parked outside. She was getting out, her face a mask of worried determination. I banged on the window, but the sound was a dull, muted thud. The house was soundproofed from the inside now, too. She couldn't hear me. She went to the front door and knocked. I heard the sound, faint and distant. She tried the knob. It was locked. She called my name. I screamed it back. But my voice was a dead, flat thing in the silent, waiting air of the house. And then I saw it. The plaster on the wall by the front door, the wall right next to where she was standing, began to ripple. A new face was beginning to form. A woman's face. Her face. It was going to take her, too. It was going to surround me with the faces of everyone I had ever loved. A living, breathing, and eternal mausoleum of my own personal history. I was not just going to be its prisoner. I was going to be the curator of my own private hell. In that moment of absolute and final despair, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. I thought of my work, of the faces I drew. I was a man who brought form to the formless, who created order from the chaos of memory. And this house, this entity, was doing the same thing. It was an artist, a monstrous and deeply and profoundly lonely artist. And its medium was me. I could not fight it. I could not run from it. So I had to do the one thing it would not expect. I had to create a piece of art that it could not comprehend. I had to create a new face. I ran back to my studio, the one room in a house that had, so far, remained untouched. I grabbed my sketchbook, my charcoal, my graphite. I sat on the floor, in the center of the living room, my back to the monstrous emerging face of my sister, and I began to draw. I did not draw a face of sadness or of fear or of rage. I did not draw a face from my past. I drew a face from a future that I was now, in this last desperate act, trying to create. I drew a face of pure, unadulterated, and utterly irrational joy. I drew a man laughing, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his mouth open in a wide, beautiful, and unrestrained shout of pure, unbridled happiness. I poured every last remaining ounce of my own depleted life force, of my own desperate hope for a future that was not this, into the drawing. I drew a face that had no place in this house of sorrow. I drew a face that was a lie, a beautiful, powerful, and defiant lie. The whispering in the walls faltered. The rippling of the plaster on the wall behind me slowed and then stopped. The house, the entity, was confused. This was an emotion it did not understand. Joy was a language it did not speak. My grief, my fear, my rage, that was its food, its building material. This was poison. I kept drawing, my hands a frantic, desperate blur. I was not just drawing a picture. I was performing an exorcism. I was fighting a monster not with iron and salt, but with charcoal and hope. The face of Michael on the far wall began to fade, to recede back into the plaster, its perfect, sad features contorting in a look of profound and deep and utter confusion. The house began to groan, a low, structural, and deeply wounded sound. The cold in the air began to recede. I finished the drawing. I held it up. It was the best thing I had ever created. It was a face of pure, impossible, and defiant life. And I taped it to the wall, directly over the spot where the face of my sister had begun to form. "This is my house now," I whispered, my voice a raw and shaky and finally, blessedly, hopeful thing. "And this is the only face you're allowed to have." The house let out a long, shuddering, and deeply mournful sigh, a sound that was not of a monster, but of a lonely and finally defeated thing. And then it was silent. The lock on the front door clicked open. I stumbled to the door and threw it open. Sarah was there, her hand raised to knock again, her face pale with worry. She looked at me, at the wild and ragged and charcoal smeared and finally, truly and deeply and beautifully alive man that I had become. "Elias," she whispered, "are you okay?" I looked at her, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I smiled. A real smile, a true smile, a smile that was not a memory or a ghost or a lie. It was just a smile. "Yeah," I said, my voice a quiet and steady and finally peaceful thing. "Yeah, I think I am." I woke up in a hospital. The staff won't tell me what year it is. The first sensation was the hum, a low, soft, persistent thrum that seemed to vibrate not just in my ears, but in the very marrow of my bones. It was the sound of a perfectly functioning, utterly sterile machine. The second sensation was the smell, antiseptic, clean to the point of being aggressive, a scent so devoid of organic life it felt like the opposite of breathing. My eyes opened. The world was a uniform, shadowless, milky white. The ceiling, the walls, the thin synthetic blanket covering me, all the same shade of clinical non-color. My name is Mark Thorne. I knew this with a sudden crystalline certainty. I was 34 years old. I was an architect. I was engaged to a woman named Anna, a woman whose laugh sounded like wind chimes and whose hair smelled of lavender and sunshine, and I had been in a car accident. The memory came back in a jagged, violent flash, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, the blinding glare of headlights where they shouldn't be, the sickening concussive crunch of metal, and Anna's hand, suddenly weightless in my own. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to obey. It felt like a borrowed suit, heavy and disconnected. A soft, pleasant chime sounded somewhere in the room, and a woman appeared at my bedside. She was dressed in the same seamless white as the room, her features calm and symmetrical, her smile gentle but utterly unreadable. A name tag on her chest read, "Elara, Cognitive Support." "Welcome back, Mark," she said, her voice as smooth and placid as a still lake. "It's good to see you awake. Please, do not be alarmed. You are safe." "Anna," I rasped, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "My fiancée. Was she—" Elara's smile didn't waver. "All will be made clear in time. For now, your focus must be on recovery. Your body has been dormant for a significant period. We must reestablish your baseline functions." Her words were like pillows, soft and designed to smother any hard, sharp questions. But one question pushed its way through the fog of my confusion. It felt like the most important question in the world, the anchor I needed to tether myself to reality. "How long?" I asked. "How long have I been out?" She took a small silver device from her pocket and ran it over my chest. A soft, green light pulsed from it. "Your vital signs are stabilizing nicely. That's a very positive indicator." "You didn't answer my question," I said, a flicker of irritation cutting through my weakness. "The concept of how long is relative, Mark," she said, her placid expression unwavering. "Temporal awareness can be disorienting after a significant trauma. Our priority is your cognitive and physiological well-being. We will address all your questions during your scheduled sessions." She tapped a small, almost invisible panel on the wall, and a tray slid out, holding a small bowl of a thick beige paste. "Your nutrient intake is critical at this stage. Please consume this. It has everything your body needs." I stared at the paste, then back at her. Her refusal to answer was so deliberate, so unnatural. It wasn't that she didn't know, it was that she wouldn't say. A new, colder fear began to snake its way around the hot core of my grief for Anna. "What year is it?" I asked, the words stark and loud in the quiet room. Elara's smile finally faltered, just for a fraction of a second. A tiny micro-expression of something. Annoyance? Pity? It was gone as quickly as it came. That is not a productive question at this stage of your recovery, Mark. We find that focusing on the present moment yields the best results. Now, please, your nutrients. She left the room as silently as she had entered. I was alone with the humming, the antiseptic smell, the beige paste, and a profound, terrifying sense of dislocation. It was the first day of my new life, a life in which the simple act of asking for the date was considered an unproductive question. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous, disorienting routine, a life lived in a white box. My physical strength returned with an almost unnatural speed. The nutrient paste, which tasted of nothing at all, seemed to repair my atrophied muscles at a cellular level. A man named Coyle, a physical therapist with the same calm, detached demeanor as Elara, would guide me through exercises that felt both alien and familiar. My body remembered how to move, but it was a distant, echoic memory. My real work, they told me, was in the cognitive sessions with Elara. We would sit in 2 white chairs in my white room, and she would ask me questions. She'd show me images on a tablet, a tree, a house, a dog, and ask me to identify them. At first, it felt like a test for a toddler. But the questions grew more complex, more personal. "Tell me about your childhood home, Mark," she'd say, her pen poised over a data pad. "It was a 2-story colonial on Maple Street," I'd begin. "A big oak tree in the front yard with a tire swing." She would listen patiently, and then she would gently correct me. "Our records indicate it was a single-story ranch house on Elm Avenue. The tree was a sycamore. The memory of a tire swing is a common confabulation, a memory echo from a piece of media you likely consumed." It was maddening. Every detail I provided, every memory I held dear, was met with a calm, clinical refutation. They had a file on me, a complete and total record of the life of Mark Thorne. And it was all wrong. My father was a carpenter, not an accountant. My first pet was a cat named Mittens, not a goldfish named Bubbles. Anna and I met in a coffee shop during a rainstorm, not through a university-sponsored social mixer. "The trauma of your accident was significant, Mark," Elara explained, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "It has created inconsistencies in your neural pathways. Think of your memory as a corrupted file. We are simply helping you restore the original uncorrupted data. We are helping you find yourself again." They were trying to gaslight me into a different life. But why? The more I clung to my own memories, the more they increased the frequency of the sessions. The more they insisted my past was a fiction. My grief for Anna was the one thing I held on to with a white-knuckled grip. It was my proof. My pain was real. Our love was real. They wanted to take that away, too. They called it emotional trauma, an anomaly to be corrected. The hospital, I had no other word for it, was a labyrinth of identical white corridors. There were no windows, not a single one. There was no way to see the sun, the sky, the outside world. There was no way to know if it was day or night. The soft, ambient light in the ceiling never changed. The staff, There were perhaps a dozen of them that I saw, moved with a silent, synchronized efficiency. They all wore the same white uniforms, the same placid smiles. They were like a hive of well-meaning, soulless insects. I never saw another patient. My repeated questions about this were met with the same frustratingly vague responses about individualized recovery protocols. The need to know the year became an obsession, a gnawing, desperate hunger. It was the key. It was the one piece of information that would unlock this whole nightmare. I tried every tactic I could think of. I tried pleading. I tried demanding. I tried feigning a breakdown. Nothing worked. They would simply sedate me with a small, painless injection, and I would wake up in my bed, the lost hours, a terrifying blank space in my mind. The first crack in their perfect white wall came in the form of a child's drawing. I had been permitted a recreational period in a room that was slightly larger than my own, filled with simple geometric objects that were meant to be stimulating. A maintenance panel in the wall was slightly ajar. My curiosity, the one part of me they hadn't managed to sedate, took over. I glanced at the camera in a corner, then quickly pried the panel open. Inside was a tangle of fiber optic cables, and tucked away in a corner, a folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was a drawing done in the clumsy, earnest style of a young child. It depicted a family of stick figures standing under a sky that was a violent, angry shade of orange-red, cracked with jagged black lines. Beneath the drawing, in shaky block letters, was a single phrase, "Before the broken sky." The broken sky. The phrase echoed in my mind, resonating with a deep, primal sense of dread. I tucked the drawing into the waistband of my uniform, my heart pounding. It was a piece of the puzzle. It was proof that something had happened, something terrible, something that they were trying to erase. That night, I faked taking my mandatory sedative. I palmed a small dissolvable tablet and hid it under my tongue until the orderly left. For the first time, I was awake when I was supposed to be asleep. The humming of the facility seemed louder in the artificial night. I slid out of bed and crept to my door. I had no plan, just a desperate need to see something other than the four white walls of my room. The corridor was empty, bathed in the same eternal soft light. I began to walk, my bare feet silent on a cool, seamless floor. I didn't know what I was looking for. A window, a clock, an exit. A soft, scraping sound from a room down the hall made me freeze. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath held tight in my chest. The door was slightly ajar. I peered through the crack. Inside, an old man was on his hands and knees, trying to pry up a floor tile with a spoon he must have stolen from a meal tray. He was gaunt and wild-eyed, his white hair a chaotic halo around his head. He saw me. His eyes widened in terror, and he scrambled back, holding the spoon like a weapon. "Shh," I whispered, holding up my hands. "I'm not one of them." He watched me for a long moment, his chest heaving. Then he seemed to make a decision. "You're new," he rasped, his voice dry and cracked. "The architect. I heard them talking." "My name is Mark," I said. "What is this place?" "This place is a lie," he said, his eyes darting toward the door. "They're trying to correct you, aren't they? Trying to make you forget. Don't let them. The memories are all we have left of what it was like. Before." "Before what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Before the broken sky." The old man's face went slack with shock. Where did you hear that?" I showed him the drawing. He stared at it, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "So, you're a digger," he said with a grim, humorless smile. "Like me. They call me Elias. They say I have advanced memory corruption. They say I'm a lost cause." "Elias," I said, "what year is it?" He let out a dry, rattling laugh. "That's the one thing you can't ask, the one thing they protect above all else, because the number is so big it would break your mind, because it would prove that everything you were, everyone you knew, is dust." "What happened?" I pleaded. "The accident." "There was no accident," Elias said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Not for most of us. We were chosen. The chrysalis protocol. They put us to sleep, the ones with the skills they thought they'd need to rebuild. Architects, doctors, engineers. We were supposed to be the seed of the new world. But something went wrong. The Great Silence, they call it. The world outside, it died, and we just kept sleeping for a long, long time." His words were the ravings of a madman, but they resonated with a terrifying intuitive truth. This place wasn't a hospital. It was a bunker, a tomb, and we were the sleeping inhabitants being woken up one by one. "The ones running this place?" I asked. "Who are they?" "The Watchers," he said, his eyes wide. "The descendants of the original staff. They were born here, in the white. They've never seen the sun. They've never felt the rain. The world before is a myth to them, a dangerous, corrupted file, and we are the last living copies of that file. They're trying to wipe us clean, to make us like them before they integrate us." A chime sounded down the hall. Elias scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of terror. "You have to go. They're coming." He pressed the spoon into my hand. "Keep digging, architect," he whispered. "Don't let them win." I fled back to my room, my mind a maelstrom of horrifying new realities. I was a relic, an artifact from a dead world. My memories weren't corrupted. They were history, and the staff of this hospital were book burners trying to erase it. The fight for my past was no longer just a fight for my sanity. It was a fight for the memory of the entire human race. My relationship with my captors changed. I became a model patient. I pretended to accept their corrections. I parroted back the fabricated details of my new life. I ate the paste. I did the exercises. I smiled the same placid, empty smile as them. But beneath the surface, I was a saboteur. I was mapping the corridors in my mind, noting the patrol patterns of the orderlies, looking for a weakness in their perfect white prison. Elias and I began to communicate in secret. We would leave messages for each other behind the loose maintenance panels using a simple code we'd devised. He told me more about the facility, which he called the Janus Cradle. He told me there were different levels. We were in the integration wing. Below us was the hibernation bay, where hundreds, maybe thousands more were still sleeping. Above us was command, where the Watchers lived, and somewhere there was an exit, a door to the outside world. Our goal was simple and insane. We had to get out. We had to see the broken sky for ourselves. Elias had a plan. He had been here for years and had managed to steal a low-level key card from a careless orderly. It wouldn't get us to command, but it might get us into the maintenance tunnels that honeycombed the facility. Our chance came during a system-wide diagnostic, a monthly event where the surveillance system was briefly rebooted, leaving small gaps in the camera coverage. The escape was a heart-stopping, terrifying blur. Under the cover of the reboot, we slipped out of our rooms and met in a deserted corridor. Elias swiped the card, and a nearly invisible seam in the wall hissed open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. We plunged into it, the door hissing shut behind us, sealing us in the dusty, humming darkness of the cradle's guts. The tunnels were a different world. They were dark, cramped, and filled with the ghosts of old technology. Thick bundles of cables coated in a thick layer of gray dust snaked along the walls. Here and there, I saw logos and brand names that were achingly familiar, relics from my own time: General Electric, IBM, Panasonic. They were like fossils from a prehistoric age. We were moving through the skeleton of a dead world. We found a maintenance nexus, a small chamber where several tunnels converged. In the center was a dusty computer terminal, an ancient-looking desktop computer from the early 21st century. It was dead, of course, but beside it, on a shelf, was a stack of leather-bound logbooks. We opened the first one. The entries were handwritten, the ink faded, but still legible. The date on the first page made my breath catch in my throat. October 23rd, 2026. My accident had been in August of 2026. The logbook was the journal of Dr. Eris Thorne, the original director of the Janus Cradle. Not a cold young man who was my doctor, but his ancestor, his namesake. I read his words, my horror growing with every page. He wrote of a world teetering on the brink of collapse, not from war, but from something far more insidious. A series of cascading ecological disasters, a runaway greenhouse effect that was melting the poles and turning the skies a permanent, hazy red. He wrote of the chrysalis protocol, a desperate last-ditch effort to preserve a select group of humanity's best and brightest, to put them to sleep until the earth could heal itself. October 29th, 2026. The great silence has begun. All external communications went dark this morning. We are on our own now. The sky is the color of rust. May God have mercy on the souls of those we left behind. May 12th, 2048. The first of the cradle-born generation has come of age. They have never known a blue sky. They look upon us, the sleepers and the original staff, with a mixture of awe and pity. They call our world the before times. July 3rd, 2091. I am the last of the originals. The others are gone. The cradle-born run this place now. They are good, pragmatic people, but they fear the past. They see the memories of the sleepers not as a history to be preserved, but as a sickness to be cured. They have begun what they call cognitive correction. They believe they are doing a kindness, sparing the newly awakened the grief of a world that is gone forever. I have tried to argue with them, but to them I'm just a sad old man clinging to ghosts. The last entry was dated a week later. The writing was shaky, almost illegible. They are wrong. Memory is not a sickness. It is the only thing that proves we were ever alive at all. I have hidden these logs. Maybe one day one of the sleepers will find them. Maybe one of them will be strong enough to remember for us all. I looked up from the book, my eyes stinging. 100 years. 200. The number didn't matter. Elias was right. The world I knew, the world of Anna, of Maple Street, of blue skies and rainstorms, was not just gone. It was ancient history. A noise from the tunnel behind us made us jump. The sound of footsteps. They knew we were gone. We had to move. We grabbed the logbooks and plunged deeper into the labyrinth. We were lost for what felt like days. We survived on the emergency nutrient packs we found in a forgotten storage closet. The watchers were hunting us. We could hear their calm, dispassionate voices echoing through the tunnels, calling our names, assuring us that they only wanted to help. It was during our flight that we stumbled upon the nursery. It was a large circular room filled with rows upon rows of cryogenic pods, far smaller than the ones in the hibernation bay. These were for children, but the most horrifying part was a large glass-walled observation room. Inside, a group of cradle-born children, no older than 5 or 6, were sitting at desks, watching a large screen. On the screen was a pastoral scene from the before times, a family having a picnic in a sunny green field. "Look, children," a soft, synthesized voice was saying, "this is a memory echo. It is a simulation of the corrupted data that the sleepers carry. See how bright the light is? It is unnatural. See how the people laugh? It is a symptom of emotional dysregulation. We must be grateful for the calm, for the balance that we have achieved." They weren't just erasing our memories. They were inoculating their own children against them, teaching them to fear the very concept of our world, to fear happiness, to fear the sun. Elias, his mind already fragile, couldn't take it. He let out a strangled, grief-stricken cry and collapsed, sobbing. The sound alerted our pursuers. They were on us in seconds. They dragged Elias away, his eyes locking with mine in a final, desperate plea. "Remember," his eyes said, "I managed to escape back into the maze of tunnels. I was alone again, hunted, with the weight of a dead world on my shoulders. I knew I couldn't stay in the tunnels forever. My only chance was to go up, to get to command, to find the door. Elias had managed to slip me his stolen key card before they took him. It was a desperate gamble, but I found a sealed access ladder that his card miraculously opened. It led straight up, into the heart of the beast. The command level was a stark contrast to the rest of the cradle. The walls were a dark, polished gray. The air was warmer. This was where the watchers lived. I crept through the corridors, my heart in my throat. I saw their living quarters, as Spartan and minimalist as my own room. I saw their food synthesizers, their communal learning centers. It was a life of perfect, sterile, passionless order. I found my way to the central control room. It was a vast, circular chamber. The walls were a single panoramic screen, currently displaying the vital signs of the thousands of souls still sleeping in the hibernation bay. In the center of the room, a young man was sitting at a console. It was the man I knew as Dr. Aris. He wasn't in his white uniform. He was wearing a simple gray tunic. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "Mark Thorne," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "The architect. I must admit, you have been our most resilient subject." "Where is Elias?" I demanded, my voice raw. "He has been returned to hibernation," Aris said. "His memory file was too deeply corrupted. Perhaps in a few more generations our techniques will be advanced enough to help him, to cure him." "He wasn't sick," I snarled. "He was remembering." "Remembering a world of chaos, of pain, of uncontrolled emotions that led to its own destruction," Aris countered, his gaze unwavering. "We are offering you a gift, a second chance, a life of purpose, of balance. You can help us build the new world, but first you must let go of the old one." "My world had love," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It had art. It had Anna." For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in Aris's eyes. It wasn't pity. It was a deep, almost academic curiosity. "Anna?" he mused. The primary emotional trauma, the core of the corruption. Her file is fascinating. The depth of the codependent pathology is unlike anything we have on record. He gestured to the main screen. The vital signs were replaced by a photograph. It was a picture of me and Anna on a beach, laughing, the sun in our hair. The sight of it was a physical blow. What you call love, we call a destabilizing fixation, Eris said. It is the very thing we have worked for centuries to eliminate. The world outside is stable now, healed, but it is a delicate, fragile piece. We cannot risk contaminating it with the diseases of the past, with grief, with rage, with love. I want to see it, I said, my voice a whisper. I want to see the sky. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Very well, he said. You are resilient. Perhaps you are strong enough to see the truth and accept it. Perhaps then you will understand the kindness we are offering. He pressed a sequence of panels on his console. A section of the far wall began to retract, revealing a massive circular airlock door. This is the main egress, Eris said. It has not been opened in over 300 years. He led me towards it, my legs feeling like lead. I was about to see it, the broken sky, the world after the great silence. What year is it, Eris? I asked one last time. He paused, his hand on the final locking mechanism. By your old calendar, he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. The year is 2571, 445 years. The number was so vast, so meaningless, it didn't even register as a shock. It was just a sound. The great door hissed open. A strange, pale light, tinged with a faint violet hue, spilled into the room. A wind, cool and smelling of damp earth and strange alien blossoms, washed over me. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and looked out upon the world of 2571. It wasn't a wasteland. It wasn't a desert. It was a garden, a strange, beautiful, and utterly alien garden. The sky wasn't broken. It was a soft, perpetual twilight of lavender and rose, a permanent global aurora caused by the altered composition of the atmosphere. The vegetation was lush and bizarre, forests of glowing phosphorescent fungi and trees with leaves of spun silver. In the distance, the ruins of an ancient city, my city, were almost completely consumed by this new, vibrant nature, the skeletal remains of skyscrapers draped in iridescent moss. And the people. There were people moving through the glowing forests. They were tall and slender, their skin almost translucent, their eyes large and dark. They were the cradle-born who had left generations ago to resettle the surface. They were beautiful, peaceful. They moved with a slow, graceful purpose, their faces calm and serene. They were the children of the Watchers, the end result of a program to engineer a new, balanced humanity. And I was a monster, a relic from the age of chaos, a carrier of the emotional plague. The hospital wasn't a prison to keep me in. It was a quarantine to protect them from me. Eris stood beside me. This is what we have built, he said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound pride. A world without pain, without grief, without the destructive passions that burned your world to the ground. You can be a part of this, Mark. All you have to do is let her go. Let Anna go. I looked out at the strange, beautiful, silent world. A world without pain, a world without Anna's laugh, a world where the memory of her was a disease. I thought of the logbook. Memory is not a sickness. It is the only thing that proves we were ever alive. I had turned to Eris. His face was a mask of calm expectation. He believed he had won. He believed that seeing this new, perfect world would make me surrender my broken, chaotic past. No, I said, the word feeling like the first real thing I had said since I woke up. I didn't wait for his reaction. I turned and walked out of the airlock, down the ramp, and into the strange violet twilight of the new earth. I was a ghost, a man out of time, a walking museum of dead emotions. I was utterly, completely alone. But for the first time since I had opened my eyes in that white room, I was free. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do. I only knew that I would not forget. I would carry the memory of Anna, of our world, into this silent, peaceful future. I would be the sickness. I would be the chaos. I would be the ghost that haunted their perfect, passionless garden. I would remember for them all. I answered a phone call from my own number. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a glitch, a harmless bit of digital flotsam in the ever-congested currents of modern communication. I was an architect, a man who believed in blueprints and solid foundations, a man whose life was built on the comforting certainty of physics and logic. Ghosts, hauntings, and paradoxes were the stuff of fiction, not the carefully ordered reality of my life with my fiancée Chloe. It was a Tuesday in October. Rain, gray and relentless, slicked the streets of the city, and I was running late. I was juggling a lukewarm coffee, a portfolio case that weighed a ton, and an umbrella that seemed to have a personal vendetta against my right eye. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Fumbling, I managed to fish it out, expecting a call from my boss, a man whose patience was as thin as tracing paper. But the name on the screen wasn't his. It was my own. Daniel Reed. Beneath it was my number, the 10 digits I'd had since I was a teenager, as familiar to me as my own reflection. A spoofed number, I thought, some telemarketer in a distant country using a clever algorithm to get me to pick up. Annoyed, I swiped to answer, a sharp, "Who is this?" already on my lips. The voice that answered was my own. It wasn't just a similar voice, it was my voice, the exact same pitch, the same slight rasp from the coffee, the same cadence. It was like listening to a recording of myself, but a recording that was happening in real time. "Don't get on the 8:15 train," the voice said. It was calm, measured, but laced with an undercurrent of something I couldn't place. Urgency? Fear? I stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, the rain dripping from my useless umbrella. The 8:15 was my train. I'd taken it every day for the past 5 years. "Who is this?" I repeated, my voice a half-strangled whisper. "There's going to be a power surge at the Fulton Street Junction. The train will be stuck in the tunnel for 3 hours. You'll miss the Henderson presentation." The voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if reading a weather report. "Take the crosstown bus instead. You'll be late, but you'll make it." A cold, prickling sensation ran up my spine. The Henderson presentation was the biggest project of my career, the culmination of 6 months of sleepless nights and relentless work. Missing it would be catastrophic. This prank was too specific, too cruel. "Very funny," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Who is this? Mark? Is that you?" Mark was a colleague from work with a juvenile sense of humor. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a ticking clock. It was the same sound as the old grandfather clock in my parents' hallway, a sound I hadn't heard in years. "Just take the bus, Daniel," the voice said, and then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. A prank! It had to be a prank, some new voice-mimicking software. But the specificity of it. Fulton Street Junction. 3 hours. It was just enough to make me hesitate. The 8:15 was pulling into the station, its doors hissing open. I looked at the train, then at the bus stop down the block. Logic warred with a primal, inexplicable fear. In the end, logic lost. I turned away from the station and walked towards the bus stop, feeling like a fool. An hour and a half later, I walked into my office, soaked and flustered, but just in time for the presentation. The office was in a state of controlled chaos. Mark rushed over to me, his face pale. "Man, you are the luckiest guy on the planet," he said. "Did you hear? The 8:15 is stuck in the tunnel between stations. Massive power surge at the Fulton Street Junction. They're saying it'll be at least another 2 hours before they can get them out." The blood drained from my face. I leaned against a cubicle wall, my portfolio case slipping from my numb fingers. It wasn't a prank. It was real. I had just received a warning from the future, from a version of myself who had somehow lived through the next 3 hours and called back in time to save me. The thought was so absurd, so completely outside the realm of my carefully constructed reality that I almost laughed. But the fear that coiled in my gut was cold and hard and very, very real. The calls became a regular, if terrifying, feature of my life. They were never scheduled, always unexpected. A buzz from my pocket would reveal my own name on the screen, and the Daniel on the other end would deliver a terse, cryptic piece of advice. "Don't order the salmon for lunch. You'll get food poisoning. Take a right on Elm Street. There's a pileup on the interstate. Chloe is going to call in 10 minutes, upset about her sister. Just listen." Each prediction, no matter how small or mundane, came true. The warnings were my own personal paradoxical guardian angel. I never told Chloe. How could I? She was a psychiatrist, a woman who dealt in the rational, the explainable. She would have had me committed, or at the very least, started looking at me with that gentle, clinical pity I couldn't bear. So I kept a secret, a strange, buzzing anxiety that lived just beneath the surface of my skin. I began to rely on the calls, to wait for them. My life, once a predictable series of my own choices, was now a reactive dance with a mysterious, omniscient partner. The tone of the calls began to change. The voice on the other end, my voice, started to sound different, more confident, colder. The helpful warnings began to be interspersed with more personal, more manipulative instructions. "Don't go to your parents' anniversary dinner on Saturday," the voice said one afternoon. "Why not?" I asked. The question was a reflex. I had learned not to question, but this felt different. "You'll have a fight with your father, a bad one. It will ruin the night. Just tell them you're sick." I followed the stale advice, calling my mother with a fake, rasping cough. She was disappointed, and I felt a pang of guilt. But the thought of avoiding the inevitable circular argument with my father about my career choices was a powerful sedative. Later that week, the voice told me not to go out for drinks with Mark and the guys from work. "Mark is going to get too drunk and say something about Chloe's past that will upset you," it warned. I bailed, feigning a migraine. The voice was no longer just helping me avoid traffic jams and bad seafood. It was pruning my life. It was isolating me, cutting the threads that connected me to the people I cared about one by one. And the most terrifying part was that I was letting it. I was a willing participant in the dismantling of my own social life, all for the promise of a smoother, conflict-free existence. The first time I saw him, the other Daniel, was a hallucination, or so I told myself. I was at home, working late. Chloe was out with friends. My phone buzzed. It was my own number. "She's not with her friends," the voice said, cold and sharp. "She's meeting with her ex-boyfriend, Michael. She's been lying to you." A hot, ugly spike of jealousy and fear shot through me. It was a lie. Chloe wouldn't do that. But the voice had never been wrong. I hung up, my mind racing. I went to the window of my study, which overlooked the street, and peered out into the rainy darkness. Across the street, under the fuzzy orange glow of a street light, a man was standing. He was holding an umbrella, his face obscured by shadow, but he was wearing my coat. The dark gray trench coat I had left at the office, and he was looking right at my window. As I watched, he lifted a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. It was a stranger, a coincidence. My mind, frayed and paranoid from the stress of the calls, was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen a ghost. My ghost. The next day, the true horror began. I got to work, and my key card wouldn't open the door. After a call to security, I finally got to my desk to find an email from HR, informing me that my employment had been terminated due to gross misconduct and the unauthorized sharing of proprietary project data. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't shared anything. I would never. My boss called me into his office. He wouldn't look me in the eye. On his desk was a printout of an email chain between my work account and our biggest competitor. It contained blueprints, cost analyses, the entire Henderson project. The emails were written in my style, with my turns of phrase. They were undeniably from me, but I had never sent them. I was escorted from the building, my belongings in a cardboard box. My life, my career, had been annihilated in a single inexplicable act of digital sabotage. I drove home in a daze, my mind a screaming vortex of confusion and terror. The voice hadn't warned me about this. Why? When I got home, Chloe was there. She was sitting on the sofa, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't look at me. "Chloe, you're not going to believe what happened," I started, the words tumbling out of me. "I know," she said, her voice a dead, flat thing. "You told me this morning." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. "What are you talking about? I haven't spoken to you all day." She finally looked at me, and her expression was a mixture of fear and pity. "Daniel, stop it. You called me at 9. You were crying. You told me you'd been fired, that you'd made a terrible mistake. We talked for an hour. You said you were going to go for a drive to clear your head." I stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. "Chloe, that wasn't me." "Then who was it?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Who was it that knew that I was having doubts about us? Who brought up that stupid fight we had last year, the one we promised never to talk about again? Who apologized for being so distant and promised to be better?" She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "It was you, Daniel, but the man standing in front of me now, you're not him. You look like him, but your eyes, they're terrified. The man I spoke to this morning was calm. He was relieved. He was taking over. The voice on the phone wasn't a future version of me. It was a copy, an echo, a parasite that had been systematically clearing a space for itself by destroying my life, isolating me from my friends and family, and now it was starting to move in. The warnings hadn't been to help me. They had been to build my trust, to make me compliant. The man in the trench coat hadn't been a hallucination. He was real, and he was stealing my life. I had to prove it. I had to prove I was the real Daniel. But how do you prove you are yourself when a perfect copy, one who knows all your secrets, is telling everyone you're not? I became a ghost in my own life. I couldn't go home. Chloe was afraid of me, and I was terrified that he would be there. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind that smells of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. I was running out of money, my bank account mysteriously frozen. He was thorough. My phone was my only link, my only weapon. The calls continued, but now they were taunts. "She misses you," the voice would say, and I could hear the smirk in it. "The old you, I mean, not the paranoid, erratic mess you've become. I'm taking her to that little Italian place you both love tonight. I'm going to be the man you were never good enough to be." I started my own investigation, fueled by caffeine and terror. I became a digital archaeologist, digging through the ruins of my own life. I searched for theories, for other cases, for anything that could explain what was happening. I found fragments, whispers in forgotten internet forums, and crackpot conspiracy sites. Stories of digital doppelgangers, of quantum echoes, of people whose lives had been hijacked by perfect, malevolent copies. Most of it was nonsense, but there was a recurring theme, a point of origin, a moment of intense trauma, a near-death experience, a place where reality had become thin and a person's identity had somehow been duplicated. My mind flashed back a year, a rain-slicked highway, the screech of tires, the blinding glare of headlights, a car accident that had left me with a broken leg and a concussion, but one which the doctors had said I was lucky to have survived. That was it. That had to be it. The moment I had almost died, a copy, a shadow of myself had been created, born from the trauma and the glitch in reality. This echo had been lying dormant, observing, learning, and now it was making its move. I knew I had to confront him, but a physical confrontation was useless. He looked like me. He sounded like me. He probably even bled like me. No, I had to expose him. I had to prove to the one person who mattered that he was a fraud. I had to get to Chloe. The plan was desperate, probably insane. The echo knew my memories, my secrets, but he didn't have my soul. He didn't have my capacity for genuine, spontaneous emotion. He was a recording, a perfect but lifeless imitation. I had to create a situation where that difference would become glaringly obvious. I called Chloe from a payphone. She answered, her voice wary. "Chloe, it's me," I said, my voice raw. "I don't know who this is anymore," she whispered. I know you're scared and confused, but I need you to listen to me. I can prove it. I can prove that the man you've been talking to is not me. Meet me tonight at the old observatory." The observatory was our place. It was where I had proposed to her on a clear summer night under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. It was a place of deep, shared meaning, a place I hoped the echo wouldn't understand on an emotional level. "Why should I?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because a small part of you still knows it's me," I said, praying I was right. "Because you know the man you've been living with for the past week is off. A little too perfect, a little too calm. He's what I've always tried to be, but he's not what I am. 8 o'clock. Please, Chloe, my life depends on it." I hung up before she could refuse. Then I called my own number. The echo answered on the first ring. "Getting desperate, are we?" he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "It's over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm meeting Chloe at the observatory at 8. I'm going to tell her everything." "You do that?" The echo laughed. "She'll think you've finally lost your mind completely. In fact, I think I'll come too. It will be fun to watch." It was exactly what I wanted. That night, the air was cold and sharp. The observatory stood on its hill like a silent white domed sentinel against the star-dusted sky. I got there early, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Chloe arrived at 8 on the dot. She was wrapped in a thick coat, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight. She stood 10 feet away from me, her arms crossed, a wall of fear and distrust between us. "Daniel, this is crazy," she began. "Just listen," I pleaded. "He's coming. You're going to see us both." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. It was me. He was wearing my favorite leather jacket, his hair styled exactly like mine. He walked towards us with a confident, easy stride. He stopped beside Chloe and put a protective arm around her shoulder. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "See, honey," the echo said, his voice a perfect imitation of my own, full of gentle concern. "I told you he was unwell. He needs help." Chloe looked from him to me, her eyes wide with a terrifying, disbelieving comprehension. Seeing us both there, 2 identical men, was shattering her reality. "This is impossible," she breathed. "Now, Chloe," I said, my voice shaking, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to ask him the same question. It's the question you asked me right here, on this spot, the night I proposed." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "The question?" "You know the one," I urged, my eyes locked on hers, trying to pour every ounce of our shared history, our love, our genuine connection, into that single gaze. She turned to the echo. What was the question?" The echo smiled, a smooth, confident expression. "It's a trick, sweetheart. You never asked me a question. You were crying so hard you could barely speak. You just nodded and kissed me. It was a good guess, a logical one. It was what had happened on the surface, but it wasn't the truth." Chloe's eyes widened. She turned to me. "Daniel?" I took a deep breath. "You looked up at the moon and you asked me, if we build a life as beautiful as that, will we be afraid to live in it? And I told you, only if we live in it alone." Chloe let out a choked sob. It was a small, intimate, nonsensical detail, a fragment of a memory so personal it had never been spoken of again. A memory a perfect copy could never have, because it wasn't a memory of fact, but a memory of feeling. It was the emotional texture of our lives, something he couldn't access. The echo's smile faltered. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than confidence in his eyes. Confusion. And then rage. "It's a lucky guess," he snarled, his voice losing its perfect mimicry, becoming harsher, flatter. "He's been stalking us, listening to us." But the spell was broken. Chloe took a step away from him towards me. "Get away from me," she whispered to the echo. The echo's face contorted. the mask of me slipping to reveal the monster beneath. You can't have her. You can't have this life. It's mine. I earned it. I'm better than you. I'm the version of you without the anxiety, without the doubt, without the crippling fear of failure. I'm what you always wanted to be. You're a ghost, I said, my own voice finding a strength I didn't know it possessed. You're an echo of a bad memory. You're nothing. He lunged at me, his face a mask of fury. But he wasn't lunging at me in the physical world. I felt a sudden psychic pressure, a crushing assault on my mind. He was trying to invade my consciousness, to overwrite me. I saw flashes of the car crash, felt the phantom pain in my leg, the terror of the spinning metal. He was using my own trauma as a weapon against me. But I wasn't the same man who had been in that crash. The last few weeks had forged a new kind of resilience in me. I had been stripped of everything I thought defined me, my job, my home, my identity, and I was still standing. I pushed back, not with anger, but with acceptance. I accepted the fear. I accepted the doubt. I accepted the flawed, messy, imperfect reality of who I was. You're right, I projected into his mind. I am afraid. I am doubtful. That's what makes me real. You're just a copy, a perfect, empty copy. The echo screamed, a sound that was both in the air and inside my head. His physical form began to flicker like a bad television signal. He was an entity built on a stolen identity, and now that his foundation had been proven false, he was coming apart. He wavered, his image stretching and distorting, his features melting like hot wax. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled not with rage, but with a terrifying hollow emptiness. And then he dissolved, turning into a cloud of shimmering, static-like particles that were caught in the wind and scattered into the night. Silence. The only sound was Chloe's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. I stumbled forward, and she met me halfway, her arms wrapping around me in a desperate, clinging embrace. We just stood there for a long time, under the cold, silent watch of the stars, two survivors of an impossible storm. We rebuilt. It wasn't easy. The world doesn't have a protocol for dealing with a supernatural doppelganger who commits identity theft. I couldn't get my old job back, but I found a new one. We moved to a new apartment, trying to outrun the ghosts of our old life. The trust between Chloe and me, though shattered, was slowly, painstakingly being glued back together. We were scarred, but we were real. But I know he's not truly gone, not completely. He wasn't a creature I could kill. He was a possibility I had to disprove. He was a part of me, a dark potential, a shadow born from my own fear. I defeated him, but I can't destroy him. He's a latent file in the universe's hard drive, waiting. And so every time my phone rings with an unknown number, my heart seizes in my chest. Every time I see my own reflection in a dark window, I look for a flicker, a distortion. I live with the constant, quiet, terrifying knowledge that reality is a fragile thing, and that somewhere, in the static between the signals, a version of me is still out there, and he might just decide to call again. I streamed myself sleeping. Someone knocked on my door while I was watching. The idea was born, as most of my bad ideas are, from a potent cocktail of boredom, narcissism, and the relentless, gnawing need for content. My name is Ethan, and for the past 3 years, I've been a mid-level streamer on a platform that rewards consistency over quality. My niche, if you could call it that, was ambient horror. I'd play obscure, atmospheric horror games, narrate creepypastas in a low, sonorous voice, or simply host long, quiet streams from my dimly lit apartment, allowing the natural, unsettling sounds of my pre-war building to become the star of the show. My audience was small but loyal, a collection of fellow insomniacs and weirdos who found a strange communal comfort in our shared digital loneliness. The concept was deceptively simple: a 24/7, uninterrupted live stream of me sleeping. I called it the Somnus Project. The tagline I came up with was, "What happens when we're not watching?" It was a nod to the paranormal, a wink to my horror-loving audience, but in reality, it was a gimmick, a high-concept, low-effort way to keep my channel active, to hoover up a few extra donations while I was literally unconscious. Setting it up was easy. I mounted a wide-angle, night vision-capable webcam on a tripod in the corner of my bedroom, positioning it to capture my bed and most of the room. I set up a dedicated laptop to handle the stream, its screen a glowing, hypnotic eye in the darkness. On the first night, I went through my usual pre-stream ritual, talking to the chat, which was buzzing with a mixture of curiosity and mockery. "Bro is literally gonna get paid to sleep," one user typed. "What if he snores?" another asked. "Hope a ghost shows up, LOL," wrote a third. I laughed it off, signed off with my usual, "Stay safe in the shadows," and went to bed. I fell asleep to the quiet hum of the laptop and the knowledge that a few hundred strangers were watching me drool on my pillow. It was a profoundly weird, quintessentially 21st century feeling. The first few days were a bust, paranormal-wise. I snored, I tossed and turned. I once mumbled something about a missing spreadsheet in my sleep. The stream was, as expected, mind-numbingly boring, but my viewership numbers were up. People would leave the stream on in the background, a kind of bizarre human white noise machine. The donations trickled in, small amounts with messages like, "For your electric bill, Sleep King," or "Hope you're having sweet dreams." It was working. I would spend my waking hours in my living room, which doubled as my office, editing videos, answering emails, and, of course, watching the stream. It was a strange, out-of-body experience to be sitting on my sofa, drinking coffee, while simultaneously watching a live feed of my own empty, unmade bed. The bedroom door was always visible in the shot. It was a heavy, solid oak door, and I had a habit of closing it firmly every night. The first anomaly occurred on the fourth night. I was up late reviewing the VOD, video on demand, from the previous night, looking for any highlights I could clip for social media. A particularly loud snore, a funny sleep mumble. I was fast-forwarding through the long, static hours of darkness when I saw it. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the bedroom door, which I had distinctly remembered closing, slowly, silently, crept open. I stopped the playback, my heart giving a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I rewound it and watched again, in real time. The movement was almost imperceptible. A thin black sliver appeared between the door and the frame, widening by a millimeter every few seconds, until the door was opened by a good 6 inches. There was no sound, no creak of hinges. It was like the door was made of smoke. It stayed open for the rest of the night. My blood ran cold. My building was old, the floors uneven. It was possible, I told myself, that the door hadn't been properly latched and had swung open on its own. A draft, perhaps. It was a rational, logical explanation, and I clung to it like a life raft. But I had never known that door to swing open on its own before. It was a heavy, well-fitted door. That night, before I went to bed, I made a point of not just closing the door, but locking it. I even gave the knob a hard jiggle on camera for the chat to see. "Just making sure we don't have any drafts tonight, guys," I said with a nervous laugh. I watched the VOD the next day. The door had stayed closed. I felt a wave of relief, followed by a pang of disappointment. A small, content, hungry part of me had been hoping for a ghost. But the next night, something else happened. Something I couldn't explain away with drafts or uneven floors. I was watching the VOD from the night before. At 2:47 a.m., one of the books on my bedside table, a heavy hardback copy of House of Leaves, slid off the table and fell to the floor with a soft, muffled thud. I hadn't even noticed it when I woke up. I had just picked it up and put it back without a second thought. But watching it on the replay, it was unnerving. It didn't just tip over, it slid, as if pushed by an invisible hand, moving a good 2 inches horizontally before it fell. The chat, which was watching the VOD along with me, went wild. "You WTIF, was that? Okay, that's not a draft. Demon, confirmed." I was skeptical, but I was also a streamer. I knew content when I saw it. I clipped the video of the fallen book and the opening door and posted them online. The clips got more views than anything I had ever produced. My follower count started to climb. I was no longer just the Sleep King. I was the guy with the haunted apartment. The phenomena grew in intensity, but they were always subtle, always deniable. A shadow that would move in a way that didn't match any light source. A soft, whispering sound that was barely audible on the microphone. A sound I always dismissed as audio. Artifacting. My alarm clock, a digital one, would sometimes be set to a different time when I woke up, always just a few minutes off. I was living a strange, bifurcated life. During the day, I was the excited, slightly spooked host, analyzing the footage with my growing audience, speculating about ghosts and poltergeists. But at night, when I had to actually go into that room and sleep, a real gnawing fear began to take root. The room felt different. The air was heavier, colder. I felt like I was sleeping on a stage, not just for my viewers, but for an unseen, silent audience that was already in the room with me. I started talking to it, not on stream, but in the quiet of the room before I went to bed. "If you're here," I'd whisper into the darkness, "give me a sign, a real one." It was a stupid, horror movie trope thing to do, but I couldn't help myself. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught between the performance of being haunted and the terrifying possibility that it was real. The real sign came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks into the Somnus Project. It was one of the rare nights I decided not to review the VOD from the night before. I had been out with friends, a brief, desperate foray into the normal world. I came home late, exhausted. I glanced at the stream on my phone. My bed was empty, the room silent. I went to bed, closed and locked the door, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling watched. It was a palpable, physical sensation, like the feeling of static electricity on your skin. I sat up in bed. Everything seemed normal. The door was still closed. The books were on the table, but the air was thick with a kind of resonant, humming silence. I went into the living room and pulled up the stream on my main monitor. I wasn't going to review the whole VOD. I was just going to check on something. A new paranoid ritual I had developed. I would check the moment I got into bed and the moment I woke up just to make sure no time was missing, that there were no gaps in the recording. I scrubbed the timeline back to the moment I had entered the room last night. There I was, walking into frame, getting into bed, pulling up the covers. Everything was normal. Then I scrubbed forward to this morning, to the moment I had woken up. I watched myself sit up, look around, and then get out of bed. Normal. But something was nagging at me, a sliver of unease. I decided to watch the whole night. On 2x speed, the hours flew by in a blur of me tossing and turning in the ghostly green-tinged glow of the night vision. The digital clock in the corner of the stream ticked by. 2 hours a.m., 3 hours a.m., 4 hours a.m. Nothing. And then, at 4:22 a.m., it happened. My sleeping form on the bed suddenly went rigid. Not the kind of stiffness from a bad dream, but an unnatural board-like rigidity. And then my body began to levitate. I stared at the screen, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. It was not a hoax. It was not a trick of the camera. My body, my sleeping, unconscious body, was lifted a good foot off the mattress, held there for nearly 30 seconds by an unseen force, and then gently, slowly lowered back down. There were no wires. There was no one else in the room. I just floated. My coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the floor. I didn't even flinch. I just kept staring at the screen, at the impossible, undeniable evidence of what had happened in my room while I slept. The whispers, the moving objects, they weren't prelude. They were the opening act. This was the main event. I replayed the clip a dozen times. My mind, a frantic, drowning thing, tried to find a rational explanation, a dream, a hallucination. But I wasn't asleep when I was watching this. This was a recording. It was real. The thing in my apartment wasn't just moving my books, it was moving me. My first impulse was to end the stream, to pack a bag and leave, to burn the apartment to the ground. But the second impulse, the one that had been conditioned by years of chasing views and engagement, was different. This was the Holy Grail. This was the kind of footage that could make a career. This was the ghost I had been hoping for, even though its reality was 1,000 times more terrifying than I had ever imagined. Against every instinct of self-preservation I possessed, I clipped the levitation video. I posted it to my social media with a single, trembling, all-caps caption. I need help. This is not a joke. My channel exploded. The clip went viral, ricocheting across the internet. It was debated on Reddit, analyzed on YouTube, and even picked up by a few mainstream paranormal news sites. My viewer count skyrocketed from a few hundred to tens of thousands. I was no longer a mid-level streamer. I was a global phenomenon. I was the levitating man. The world was divided. Half believed it was one of the most convincing pieces of paranormal evidence ever captured. The other half believed I was a master hoaxer, a digital magician who had somehow pulled off the perfect illusion. The debate only fueled the fire. I was a prisoner in my own home. I was too terrified to sleep in the bedroom, but I was also too terrified to end the stream. I had created a monster, and now I had to keep feeding it. I started sleeping on the sofa in the living room, leaving the bedroom empty, a stage for whatever entity had taken up residence there, and the activity increased. Now that it had an audience, it began to perform. The door would be thrown open with violent force. The books would fly off the shelves. One night, the word "get" was scrawled on a wall in what looked like ash or soot. The next night, the word "out" appeared beside it. My life became a 24/7 horror show, and I was both the star and the sole terrified audience member in the front row. My mental state was disintegrating. I was a raw nerve, jumping at every shadow, my hands in a perpetual shaky tremor. The money was pouring in, but I couldn't spend it. The fame was suffocating. I was the ringmaster of a circus I could not control. And then came last night. I had been awake for nearly 48 hours, surviving on caffeine and raw fear. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, not even on the sofa. I was sitting in my computer chair, the warm glow of the monitor, my only companion, watching the live feed from the bedroom. The chat was a frantic, scrolling waterfall of text. Thousands of people from all over the world watching the empty, haunted room with me. For hours, there was nothing, just the quiet, malevolent stillness of the room. The "get out" on the wall seemed to pulse in the night vision. And then, at 3:13 a.m., the same time the door had first opened a lifetime ago, a new phenomenon began. A knock. A soft, hesitant, three-beat knock. Knock, knock, knock. It was not coming from the bedroom. It was coming from my front door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. My neighbors were a quiet, elderly couple who were in bed by 9. No one ever knocked on my door this late. The chat exploded. Did anyone else hear that? Someone's at the door. Don't answer it, Ethan. I stared at the monitor, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It's probably a neighbor, I typed into the chat, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. Loud music or something? But I knew it was a lie. My apartment was silent. And then I looked at the live stream feed from my bedroom, and what I saw made the world dissolve into a roaring, static-filled void in my ears. On the screen, in the live real-time feed of my bedroom, a figure was standing. It was a tall, thin silhouette, featureless and black, standing in the center of the room where there had been nothing but empty air a second before. It was not a shadow. It had depth, dimension. It was a hole in the shape of a man, a void that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. It was perfectly still, and it was facing the camera. I couldn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a hard, painful knot of pure, undiluted terror. The thing on my screen was not a ghost. It was not a poltergeist. It was something else, something that had been drawn to the attention, to the energy of thousands of people, all focused on this one small room. I had not just opened a door for a ghost. I had opened a portal, and something had stepped through. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking at my front door was louder now, a frantic, angry pounding. It was in sync with the pulsing of the blood in my ears. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monitor. The figure in the bedroom slowly lifted an arm. Its hand was a blur of static, but it was pointed directly at the camera, pointed at me. And then the voice. It wasn't in the room. It wasn't on the stream. It was inside my head. A dry, rasping, impossibly ancient sound like the crumbling of a tombstone. You opened the door. Now let me in. The knocking on my front door was no longer a knock. It was a violent, splintering crash, as if someone was throwing their entire body against the wood. The heavy, solid oak was groaning, the frame vibrating. My mind finally broke free from its paralysis. I scrambled back from my desk, my chair tipping over and crashing to the floor. I looked wildly around my living room, my sanctuary, which now felt like a death trap. The bedroom was compromised. The front door was about to give way. I am writing this now frantically on my phone, huddled in the one place I have left to hide, the small windowless bathroom. I have barricaded the door with a laundry hamper, a pathetic, flimsy defense against the impossible. The pounding on the front door has stopped, but the silence that followed is so much worse. I can hear footsteps, soft, dragging footsteps just outside the bathroom door, and a low, whispering sound, a sibilant, multi-toned whisper that seems to be coming from all directions at once. It's the sound from the stream, the sound I had dismissed as an audio glitch. It is not a glitch. It is the sound of its voice. My phone is my only light. I have the live stream of my bedroom still open on the screen. The figure is gone. The room is empty again. But that's not a comfort. It just means it's no longer in there. It's out here with me. The doorknob of the bathroom is turning. Slowly, silently, I am watching it happen. My own reflection, a pale, terrified ghost in the dark screen of my phone. My Somnus project was a success. I asked the question, what happens when we're not watching? And I got the answer. Something wakes up, and it watches you back. And then it comes to visit. I created a viral sensation. I have millions of viewers now, but the content is no longer mine to control. The show is being run by my new silent partner. I am the final act. The lock on the door just clicked. The whispering is getting louder. I think I know what the final clip is going to be. I joined a sleep study. Everyone else disappeared on night 3. The flyer was a small, unassuming rectangle of cheap, glossy paper, tacked to the overstuffed bulletin board in the graduate student lounge. It was a beacon of bland, institutional hope in a sea of roommate-wanted ads and free pizza for your soul campus ministry flyers. Participants needed for a study on the restorative effects of deep sleep, it read. The compensation was a number so ludicrous, so disproportionate to the task of simply sleeping, that it felt like a typo. $20,000 for a 1-week inpatient study. To me, a Ph.D. candidate in theoretical physics, a man whose life had become a Sisyphean struggle to pay rent on a grad student stipend while simultaneously trying to solve the mysteries of the universe, that number wasn't just money. It was a lifeline. It was a year of ramen noodles and peace of mind. It was the ability to think about something other than the crushing weight of my own self-imposed and deeply intellectual poverty. My name is Simon. I have always been a man who believed in data, in quantifiable and observable reality. The world, to me, was a complex but ultimately solvable equation. I did not believe in ghosts or in magic or in any phenomenon that could not be explained by the elegant and sometimes brutal laws of physics. This, I would later realize, was a profound and deeply arrogant failure of my imagination. The study was being conducted by a private and vaguely sinister research group called the Somnos Institute. Their intake facility was a stark, minimalist, and deeply unnerving office in a downtown skyscraper, a place that smelled of expensive and probably toxic air freshener. The man in charge was a Dr. Elias Vance, a man with the cold, dead eyes of a shark and a smile that was a masterpiece of insincere corporate reassurance. He spoke in a smooth, practiced baritone, his words a soothing and utterly meaningless river of scientific jargon. The Somnus Protocol, he explained, his hands clasped on his large mahogany desk, is designed to isolate and amplify the theta wave activity in the brain during REM sleep. We believe that this specific frequency is the key to unlocking the human mind's latent and largely untapped potential for self-repair, for accelerated learning, for a kind of psychic decluttering, if you will. He made it sound like we were about to receive a deluxe neurological spa treatment. I and the other 4 participants were chosen for our unremarkable and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and we were chosen for our normality. We were a motley but uniformly healthy and psychologically stable crew. There was Maya, a sharp, cynical, and deeply sarcastic law student. Ben, a quiet, gentle, and deeply introverted software engineer. Chloe, a bubbly and relentlessly optimistic yoga instructor. And Marcus, a former soldier, with a quiet, watchful, and deeply intimidating presence. We were 5 ordinary people, united by our shared and desperate need for a large and seemingly easy sum of money. The facility itself was in the sub-basement of the same skyscraper, a place that was accessible only by a private keycard-operated elevator. As the doors hissed shut behind us, sealing us in, I felt a familiar and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a flicker of claustrophobia. The facility was a self-contained and windowless world of soft, ambient lighting, recycled and slightly metallic-tasting air, and a profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a silence that was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a powerful and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a controlled silence. We were each assigned a small, comfortable, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a sterile room. The bed was a marvel of biometric technology, its mattress a complex and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a web of sensors that would monitor our every heartbeat, our every breath, our every neurological flicker. A small, unobtrusive, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a camera was mounted in the corner of the ceiling, its single, black, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and its unblinking eye a constant and silent observer. The first 2 nights were a model of scientific and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a boring routine. We would eat a bland but nutritionally perfect meal in the communal area. We would undergo a battery of cognitive tests, memory games, and logic puzzles. And then we would retire to our individual pods to sleep, a thin and almost invisible IV line taped to our arms, delivering what Dr. Vance had called a proprietary theta wave enhancing amino acid solution. The sleep was incredible. It was a deep, dreamless, and profoundly and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and It was a restful abyss. I would wake up feeling a clarity, a focus that I hadn't experienced since my undergraduate, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and my Adderall-fueled days. The others reported the same. We were sharper, faster, and our scores on the cognitive tests were improving at an exponential rate. The $20,000 felt less like a payment and more like a bonus for a life-altering and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a very expensive and very effective and very, very strange and very, very strange and very, very strange, and it was a good sleep. The change occurred on the third night. I woke up as usual to the soft, gentle, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a chime that signaled the beginning of our waking cycle. I felt the same, profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and I felt the same clarity. I sat up. The IV had been disconnected, as it always was, by some silent and unseen and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a mechanism. I went to the communal area for breakfast. The room was empty. The table was set for 5, as it always was, with 5 identical bowls of the same bland and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and the same oatmeal-like paste. I waited. Ben was usually the first one up, a creature of quiet and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a creature of habit. Then Chloe and Maya. Marcus was always the last. I waited for 20 minutes. The silence in the room was no longer the controlled and sterile silence of the facility. It was a deep and profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was an empty silence. I went to Ben's room. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was made the same, perfect and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and the same military precision neatness as my own. I checked the other rooms, Maya's, Chloe's, Marcus's. They were all empty. Their beds were all made. Their few personal belongings, a book, a tube of chapstick, a pair of running shoes, were all gone. It was as if they had never been there. My first thought was that this was a part of the study, a psychological test, a test of my reaction to sudden and unexplained isolation. It was a logical and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a rational explanation. I went to the main door, the one that led to the elevator, to the outside world. I had expected it to be locked. It was not. It opened with a soft and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it hissed open. I stepped out into the elevator lobby. The elevator was there, its doors open, waiting. I stepped inside. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed, and the elevator began its ascent. I was free to go. The thought was not a comforting one. It was a deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a terrifying one. If this was a test, it was a very strange one. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby of the skyscraper. The morning sun was streaming through the large plate glass windows, and the city was a bustling and beautiful and wonderfully and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically. And it was a normal city. No one stopped me. No one questioned me. I walked out of the building and onto the street. The air was cool, and it smelled of exhaust fumes and roasted nuts and the thousand other beautiful and wonderful, and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and the smells of life. I was free. The $20,000 had been wired to my account that morning as promised. The study was over. I was a free and very rich man. But the others, where were the others? I went to the police. I tried to explain. My voice was a shaky and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was an unconvincing mess. 4 missing people from a secret and vaguely sinister sleep study. The officer looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and he looked at me with pity. He took a report. He promised to look into it. I knew he would not. I went home to my own small and cluttered and blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and my apartment, and I began my own investigation. The Somnus Institute, it turned out, did not exist. The address of their corporate office was a mail drop. Their website was a shell, a collection of stock photos and meaningless corporate jargon. The phone number was disconnected. The entire organization had, like my fellow participants, vanished into thin air. I was alone with the mystery, and with the $20,000, and with the strange, new, and deeply, and profoundly, and unsettlingly, and strangely, and beautifully, and tragically, and comically, and the new clarity in my own mind. The dreams started that night. They were not dreams in the traditional sense. They were visits. I would find myself in a place that was not a place, a landscape of pure, white, and endless light. And they would be there, Maya, Ben, Chloe, Marcus. They were not ghosts. They were solid. They were real. But they were different. They were calm, serene. Their eyes, which in the real world had been filled with the usual human and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and their eyes were now filled with a deep and profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a placid and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a peaceful emptiness. They would not speak to me. They would just be. They would be building things. Strange, intricate, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and they would be building things out of pure white light. They were architects of a world that was made of dreams, and I was the only one who could see them. I understood then. The Somnus Protocol was not about enhancing sleep. It was not about unlocking the mind's potential. It was about something else entirely. It was about migration. Dr. Vance had not been lying when he said he was opening a door, but it was not a door to a new level of consciousness. It was a door to a new place, a new dimension, a world that existed on the other side of sleep, a world that was, perhaps, quieter, simpler, more restful. And the others, they had chosen to stay. They had not disappeared. They had emigrated. They had left the messy and chaotic and beautiful and wonderful and finally blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and they had left this world for a world of pure and endless and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a world of sleep. And I had been the one who had come back. I was the one who had, for some reason, chosen to wake up. I live my life now in two worlds, the waking world with its noise and its chaos and its beautiful and wonderful, and finally, blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and its imperfections, and the sleeping world, the world of the endless white and silent light, where my four, lost and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and my friends are building their new and quiet and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and their new home. I am a tourist in the land of dreams. I am the last remaining and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and I am the last link to the world they left behind. I do not know if I made the right choice. The quiet and the peace and the profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and the serenity of their world is a powerful and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it is a seductive song. But I am a man of data, a man of the observable world, and this world with all its flaws and all its noise and all its beautiful and wonderful and finally blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and this world is the one I have chosen, and I will live in it for them. I will be their memory. I will be their proof that this messy and beautiful and wonderful and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and this world was once their home